Let's look at one more example of a reset by looking at Eric Meyer's reset. I'll click Get the Code, and here's the entire code. If we scroll down to the bottom of it, you can see that it's longer than the universal selector reset, but not by an awful lot. It's 47 lines of CSS code. I'm going to scroll up to the top. At the beginning of this, you can see a rather long selector that includes a number of default HTML elements. Let's look at the styles that it sets. So first, it sets the margin and padding to 0, much like the universal selector reset does. But then it goes a little further, setting the font size to 100%, setting the font shorthand property to inherit, which solves certain font property problems in certain browsers, and then vertical align, which we haven't talked about, it's setting to baseline. Let's scroll down a little bit. This says in the comments, which we haven't talked about CSS comments yet, but this is what they look like, HTML5 display role reset for older browsers. So these different elements, we've used the section element here, are all rather newer additions to HTML. So in older browsers that don't support newer versions of HTML, they have to set the display to block explicitly here in order to get them to work similarly to the way they do in newer browsers. I'll scroll down. It's setting a line height of 1 for the body. You may remember when we looked at the example for line height in W3 Schools that it mentioned briefly that the default line height for different browsers is slightly different, somewhere between 110% to 120%. Now this 1 here is the same value as 100%. And by setting every browser to a line height of 1, we can have consistent representation of the line height across different browsers, which is actually pretty important, especially when it comes to setting backgrounds. We haven't talked about the ordered list and unordered list, or OL and UL elements in HTML yet, but they come with a variety of stylings. So the way these are represented in a browser by default is as a numbered list, that would be an OL, or a bulleted list, that would be a UL. By setting the list style to none, it's stripping away the defaults of what we want that bullet to look like, what the spacing and indentation will be on those lists. Now this might seem a little strange because why wouldn't we want to represent a list as a numbered list or a bulleted list? But that's one of the choices that we're making with a reset. We're saying that we don't trust the browser styles, and so we're going to create our own styles from scratch. And this goes so far even to impact lists. On one hand, it's easy to come up with use cases for this. A lot of people use a UL tag for menus, even if they look like tabs or they're stretched across the top of a page like a main navigation scheme. And in order to get that to look properly, you have to reset the list styles on it. So this is just supposing that we're not going to expect any styles at all if we're going to use a list. And this continues down to a couple other elements that we haven't used, the block quote, Q, which is short for quote, and table elements. Okay, ultimately we're not going to use a reset here, and I'll explain why. Let me exit out of this.